This spring, I received a commission from the Maryland province of the Jesuits for an 8-foot crucifix for their future chapel in Philadelphia. This sculpture is a larger version, very similar in concept to a 3-foot crucifix completed over 10 years ago for the Reconciliation Room at Prince of Peace Catholic Church in Flowery Branch, Georgia. In this design, Christ and the cross become one. I used an actual tree with reassembled branches for the basic structure, and I added clay to form the body of Christ, who is seen to be embracing the wood on which he hangs willingly in triumph over death. The clay and wood model has been approved, and what follows is the mold-making process prior to bronze casting.
First step is to make these little clay walls that'll separate the different parts of the mold. This is an art to itself. You have to make the little wall seal completely so that the plastic and the rubber doesn't leak under it, but you can't smash it on there so hard that you distort the original clay. It's tricky, and it takes a steady hand, and Debbie is the best at this, and I am the worst. Always lots of Johnson's paste wax and lots of spray separator, or we will have a mess to deal with. This piece has no base, so it's a little more complicated to make the mold. There's nothing to stand it on. So in the beginning, we leaned it over on its back, and it's held up by the exterior steel frame that's been there the whole time. And we completed all the molds on the front side. And then I made a plywood support, and we flipped it over the other way and made the molds for the back. And then because we didn't want to destroy the original, I put the steel frame back on the back, and then we stood it up and got the molds off. This piece will be reproduced by the lost wax process, so therefore the first step when the molds get to the foundry is to make thin wax casts of each mold, and that's why we have so many. The wax is inherently weak, and you just can't deal with a big, huge sheet of wax and have it be stable. So 2 foot by 2 foot is the guidelines we've been given, and therefore we have a whole bunch of molds on each side. Each individual section of the art is coated with rubber. It takes about 3 coats to get the thickness we need, and it takes almost an hour between coats. So this is pretty much a 1 a day deal, or 2 a day, but you can't put the plastic on top of the rubber the day you put the rubber down. It cures real slow. And then on top of the rubber, we get the white is a plastic. It keeps the rubber in shape. It's also 3 coats, but it dries really fast, so you can do a lot of these in 1 day. And when the total front is all covered with molds, that's when I put the wooden frame on it so we could flip it over. This is a simple little wood frame, and it is braced back to the finished plastic mother molds with lots of little braces and glue and screws, and all I want to do is distribute the weight when we go to turn it over. On this first lift, we started out picking it up with the little engine lift here, nice and slow and steady. I was pretty anxious about the whole thing. On all the lifts after this one, we just did it by hand. We didn't use the engine lift. It turns out that the thing is really rigid, and it hadn't been a problem. It's heavy, though. It takes 3 people. with the sculpture turned face side down, we're now ready to do the molds on the back. Before we can do them, we need to remove these little clay walls that we put in place earlier. And if I would have done them, there'd be lots of repairs to be made to the original, and there would also be leaking rubber that would have to be cleaned up. But since Debbie did them, they're like perfect. She just pulls off the clay, and there's a nice clean rubber joint. And now we can proceed with partitioning off the back molds into sections using the similar little clay wall system.
As you can see, the mold making is underway in the back. And what I'm going to do next is, instead of having a one-to-one on this one section of mold over the head and shoulders, I'm making a wall on the rubber, and it's going to be a two-part mother mold because there are so many undercuts by the neck. We want to be able to lift the mother mold off of the rubber, off of the sculpture, without problem.
Now that all the molds are complete, I'm drilling bolt holes. I'm going through the back plastic, the two rubbers, and the front plastic. And I'm drilling them before we move anything. So when you put these bolts in, everything should line up correctly. So I'm drilling all the flanges all the way around before I remove any of the molds. So these seams between the different molds, when they're made, we start out with a clay wall, and we apply rubber on one side, and some of the rubber goes over the clay. And then we apply plastic, and again, some of it goes over the clay. And then the clay is removed, and we do the same on this side. So the top of this wall is a mess. It's got different layers of plastic and rubber. So before we can get these apart without damage, and to make sure they go back together smoothly, we need to remove all that crud from the top. Okay, we should just see white, yellow, yellow, and white when we're done. So that's what we're after. The white, I can see the two layers of yellow. You probably can't on the camera. And another layer of white. So we need to do all the seams all the way around. It's kind of a pain. So again, I skipped a little bit of video, but basically with it on the ground, I laid the steel frame back where it was and put the screws back where they were. And they didn't line up exactly, but I welded them back to the frame. And I added another one at the top just to make me feel better. So now we have stood up the crucifix sitting on the base, and we will start cutting the plywood into little pieces and removing molds one by one from the top down. We're cutting our way down.
Let me try to get this back together. It's so thin.
This is all
Really thin. You must have talked me into 2 layers on these. Yeah? He's cutting the wooden supports away from the figure. piece.
And a little bit of luck. Look at that.
Came right off.
Very good, sweetie. All right. Okay, the mold pieces are all crated up and they're very secure. This crate could go upside down or on any side and the mold pieces will be fine. They're fixed in there pretty tight. When the glue dries, I'll take these clamps off and put the top on. And importantly, the original is in pretty good repair. It's got a few dents in it. So worst case scenario, the truck on the way to Colorado crashes and burns up. We have the original, we could make another mold, although I'd rather take a beating. But insurance, we're covered.